Both stated they were not involved in any way. Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat fiercely denounced the attacks. Even the strict Taliban regime in Afghanistan immediately condemned them. The Libyan leader, Muammar Gaddafi, a well-known enemy of the United States, has condemned the attack and said his country was prepared to send help to the American people. Iraq called the attack the fruit of U.S. crimes against humanity. Experts believe the attacks could be the work of Saudi-born terrorist leader Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden, a billionaire Muslim fundamentalist, is currently living in hiding in Afghanistan. He is also held responsible for the 2 bomb attacks on U.S. embassies in East Africa a few years ago. He is said to have warned recently that an unparalleled attack on U.S. targets would soon take place in retaliation for U.S. support for Israel. The attacks in the United States had an almost immediate impact on the world's financial markets. Prices on European stock markets plummeted, with Frankfurt down 8.6%, Paris down 7.4%, and London down by 5.7%. The Frankfurt Exchange was evacuated after a bomb threat, and the London Exchange was evacuated as a precaution. On currency markets, the dollar dropped sharply against the euro, the Japanese yen, and the Swiss franc. The price of crude oil shot up by almost $4, closing at $29.40. At the end of European trading, the price of gold bullion was up by nearly 6%. Trading at the Amsterdam Stock Exchange was halted temporarily. New York Stock Exchange on Wall Street, not far from the twin-towered World Trade Center, remain closed throughout the day and will not be open on Wednesday. That's a bulletin of international news. Now, back to Pero de Jong.
Although there have been many attacks on U.S. installations abroad, it's rarely been hit at home. There's been nothing like this since the bombing of Pearl Harbor. For television viewers around the world, the initial reaction to the crashing of 2 planes into the World Trade Center buildings in New York was stunned disbelief. But on the streets of New York, it was shock and panic.
There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows.
I looked up, and that's when I heard the explosion. That's when the second tower came down. Again, whoever was left on the street started stampeding. I'm in the office. Right now, I'm in the main building of Pace University. People are crying. They have gas masks on their face. Authorities are making people go toward the basement. They're just doing anything that they can to move people away from the financial district.
Now, as the real extent of the damage and likely loss of life begin to register, questions are being asked. The big ones are, who did this and how many lives have they claimed? We're joined now by our correspondent in New York, Reinoud van Wachtendonk. Reinoud, in the disaster area itself, are rescue operations underway?
They are still going on. It's still quite chaotic what is going on the southern tip of Manhattan. New York hospitals are reporting that they are overwhelmed with injured people. There are triage sections set up, at times not even in the first aid and emergency departments, but outside. There are urgent calls for blood donors on New York TV and radio stations, and apparently people are listening, people are lining up, giving blood.
Is it still too early to say anything about casualties?
It is too early to give firm numbers about that, but the mayor of New York City and the police commissioner of New York City have prepared the people in New York to expect catastrophic numbers of fatal casualties. The World Trade Towers themselves, during a regular workday, which this was, house about 50,000 people. These World Trade Towers have collapsed. The attack happened just before official office hours. It was the morning rush hour, so maybe not all these 50,000 people were in the building, but still, if you add it all up, you are going to talk about hundreds, if not thousands, of people who may have perished in this.
And what are the authorities doing to reassure, at least to give information to families and relatives?
There's not that much being done. That is one of the sub-stories with this story. A lot of people in and around New York City, commuter towns all over the place, do not really know if the persons that left this morning to go to work will come back. Some of them, of course, and most of them undoubtedly will come back much later than usual, because connections with the island of Manhattan, bridges and tunnels are closed off. There also will be people, though, who will have died, and it is incredibly difficult to get contact by telephone or even cell phone with people in New York City. So there is an enormous amount of uncertainty. Tens of thousands of people now do not know 100% where the people that they said goodbye to this morning are.
And uncertainty, how close is that to panic? Are there still fears that more attacks could be undertaken?
I don't know if people realistically expect that there will be more attacks. It is so that United States Air Force fighters are patrolling the skies over New York, the coastal areas. A couple of aircraft carriers have left their ports on the east coast and are steaming up north. Their airplanes are patrolling. The only aircraft that are in the skies of the United States are military aircraft, because all civil aviation has been shut down and will stay shut down at least till noontime, the United States next day.
Okay, thank you very much, Reinoud van Wachtendonk. The prime suspect is the Saudi dissident Osama bin Laden. Some news services are reporting that the Muslim extremist warned 3 weeks ago that he and his followers would carry out an attack on the US. Our Middle East editor is Bertus Hendricks. I asked him if bin Laden is indeed the best guess.
Well, I think the word "the best guess" is appropriate here. Of course, we do not know who is behind it at this moment. And the Oklahoma precedent has made us aware that sometimes you jump to conclusions too soon, and then it turns out to be something completely different. But in this case, I'm inclined to prefer the bin Laden hypothesis, because the whole modus operandi, the kind of sophistication, the kind of network, the kind of financing you need are so huge that you need an organization with the financial capabilities and the network links that bin Laden, as far as we know it, apparently has. What we know mainly from Western intelligence services, and we know from a number of trials where people, especially for the embassy bombings in Tanzania and Kenya, were brought to trial, and from dissidents from his organization. And what we know from this, we know that he has a very extensive network, not only in the Arab world, but in the wider Islamic world at large. And that his networks are active in Kashmir, they were active in Kosovo and Bosnia before, in the Philippines with Abu Sayyaf group, and in the Arab world. So a whole, I would say, number of indications seem to point to him as a likely responsible for this action.
Now, there were also rumors that he had, in fact, hinted that he was planning a major attack on the United States. What do we know about that?
Well, he has made it very clear that he considers the United States, or the Crusaders, as he calls them, the West in general, a legitimate target. And of course, this will only have increased after the Americans tried to eliminate him with a bombing raid on his supposed hideout in Afghanistan after the embassy killings in Tanzania and in Kenya. And there are the editor-in-chief of the Al-Quds newspaper in London has said on record that a very good source had told him 3 weeks ago that something was in the works. So this also reinforces this thing. The bitter irony, of course, is that bin Laden initially came to prominence with close support from the CIA, from the Saudi government, from the Egyptian government, from the Pakistani government and their secret services in the struggle against the godless communism of the Soviet Union, which was the occupying power in the 80s of Afghanistan.
But what exactly is his grudge against the United States?
Well, I think we have to do here with a general feeling in the Islamic world, at least in those extreme circles, who feel that Islam is being discriminated against, that there is a kind of crusade, and that's the word that he uses, against the Islamic world, that the West is biased and that it is the Americans who are leading this crusade against the Islamic world, and that it is the duty of the true believers to conduct a jihad, a holy war of self-defense as they see it, and to strike the big Satan in the heart, and the little Satan, which is then Israel, also if they can.
The little Satan, Israel. There was speculation earlier that it might be a Palestinian group that had claimed responsibility, but is there a strong link to the momentum of what's been going on in the Middle East?
Well, in the Islamic world at large, and especially in the age of satellite television, daily broadcasts of the sufferings as they see it of the Palestinian people, and the fact that as they see it, the West is doing nothing but is really giving the green light to Israel to continue its occupation, all this is feeding into a kind of unease in the Islamic world, and it is this kind of unease and bitterness that again provides, I think, the fertile ground in which some extremists are being recruited into networks of Osama bin Laden, who want to get a unification of the whole Muslim world, not only the Arab world, but the whole Muslim world in their fight against what they call the Crusaders and the Jews.
That's our Middle East editor, Bertus Hendricks. America's European allies have reacted with horror to what has happened. In fact, there were concerns that NATO headquarters in Brussels might also be on the list of targets. European ministers are meeting on Wednesday to discuss how what's happened changes more or less everything. I've been hearing more about Europe's reaction from our correspondent in Brussels, Peter Veenendaal.
Shock is almost an understatement for the reactions here in Europe. There is what you might call a sense of crisis, a feeling that things will never be the same in the whole Western world after today's incredible events. Also a feeling of shared grief, enormous sympathy, solidarity with the people of the United States, who after all share the same democratic and social values. All European heads of state and government have condemned these attacks in the strongest possible words, and so did the leadership of the European Union tonight upon its return from a summit meeting in Yalta. This is what the acting president of the Union said, Belgian Prime Minister Guy Verhofstadt.
I want to express, in the name of the European Union, our entire solidarity with the United States, with our American friends, and with the American people, with our allies, and also our solidarity with all the victims and the families of the victims who live and who have lived in pitiable hours today, and certainly also in the next days.
So, feelings of crisis, feelings of solidarity, but how do those feelings translate into facts?
Well, the feeling of crisis is illustrated by emergency meetings of national governments, extreme security measures all over the continent, and a practical standstill of public life. Everybody in Europe has been glued to the television screens, hardly able to comprehend the extent of these terrorist acts. The foreign ministers of the 15 EU countries will attend a crisis meeting tomorrow, and so will all European commissioners to, as they say, evaluate and analyze the security situation. 3 of them will travel to Washington as soon as possible. Extensive consultations are already underway. Verhofstadt has already called President Bush. Europe will offer its American ally all the help it can possibly muster, first of all, of course, in the hunt for those responsible and in the global fight against terrorism, and if needed, specialist help in the aftermath of this disaster. What's clear, anyway, is that Europe feels just as involved, just as wounded by these attacks as the United States.
Now, Brussels, of course, is also the headquarters of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What has been its reaction to what's happened?
Well, the attacks are seen, or at least felt, as an act of war against the member state of the North Atlantic Alliance. That prompted an emergency meeting of the NATO ambassadors, and after that meeting, Secretary General Lord Robertson said that those responsible for the attacks will not get away with it, and he offered the alliance's closest cooperation with the Americans.
It underscores the urgency of intensifying the battle against terrorism, a battle that the NATO countries, indeed all civilized nations, must win. All allies stand united in their determination to combat this scourge. At this critical moment, the United States can rely on its 18 allies in North America and Europe for both assistance and for support. Our message to the people of the United States is that we are with you.
Lord Robertson. And he also said that possible military action in retaliation for the attacks had not been discussed. Meanwhile, all the non-essential staff has been evacuated for the time being from NATO's headquarters in Brussels as a precautionary measure.
Brussels correspondent Peter Veenendaal. Dutch politicians have added their voices to the chorus of reactions expressing profound shock about what has happened. They all agree that this was not just an attack on a single country, but on a whole system of values rooted as deeply here as in the US. Our reporter Hans Andringa has been collecting reactions from Holland's main political leaders, starting with Prime Minister Wim Kok, who warned against reacting too harshly.
Well, it's extremely difficult to find the right words. We have to continue to defend values of democracy and human rights, even in times where others who don't respect human rights have used the worst, the most extreme possible weapons and instruments. That's the lesson perhaps we have to learn from this. Don't repeat what others did.
Mr. Melkert, you're the leader of the Social Democratic Party in the Netherlands. What was your first reaction when you saw the news today on television?
It is an attack straight into the heart of the democratic world. It implies for the democratic world, United States, Europe, other democratic countries, that there is an enormous task to counter this attack in an appropriate way, and at the same time to avoid escalation by violence.
Are there any consequences for the Netherlands?
I think the Netherlands are in complete solidarity with the United States. The Netherlands will play their role in the European Union consultations to try to formulate its position in the coming days, and I'm sure that our governments will do their utmost.
Mr. Obsiffer? You are the leader of the Christian Democrats in Dutch Parliament. In what kind of situation have we landed now after the assaults in the United States?
The Statue of Liberty was watching Twin Towers. Twin Towers do not exist anymore. So the first reaction, of course, is sympathy. Big sympathy for that country, which has probably lost thousands of its citizens.
Mr. Dijkstra, leader of the Liberals, is this an attack on Western democracy?
Well, at least it's an attack on all the values that in every modern democratic state, which is based on the principles of justice. So in that respect, it's an attack on all of us.
If we try to look in the minds of the people who did it, what do they want to achieve?
I consider it completely impossible, as far as I'm concerned, to look into the minds of people who do this. Absolutely impossible.
No, for me it's unimaginable, but at the same time it happens. So we have to think of an answer to those actions, and there also is a responsibility for the international community. I think the European Union, NATO, the United Nations, it's also a matter of all those international boards. So I really hope that the international community will work together in giving here the proper answer.
That's Liberal leader Hans Dijkstra expressing some of the shock felt here in the Netherlands as well. To recap, in case you've just tuned in, the United States has been struck by a series of terrorist attacks targeting principally New York and Washington. We don't know how many people have been killed or injured, possibly thousands. The attacks began in New York, where 2 airplanes crashed into the World Trade Center at the beginning of the business day. Shortly after, another plane was flown into the Pentagon. The main suspect is the Saudi dissident Osama bin Laden, who's also believed to have been behind the World Trade Center bombing in 1993. We leave you now with the reaction of U.S. President George W. Bush.
Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured, and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
And at this point, it's time to wish you good night if you're listening in either North America or Europe. We're back, though, at 4:30 UTC on the European Bouquet on Intelsat 707 transponder 23B and AsiaSat 2 transponder 10B. And on shortwave to North America using the frequencies of 6165 and 9590 kilohertz. We can also be heard in 2 new daily transmissions at 10:30 UTC. We can be heard on the East Coast using 5969 kilohertz in the 49-meter band. Then at 14:30 UTC, we switch to the West Coast using 15220 kilohertz in the 19-meter band. And of course, Newsline will continue with its coverage of the events today in the United States and their aftermath. But for now, it's goodbye, and thank you for listening.